Have you ever smiled in a family photo while standing beside the person quietly preparing to erase everything your family spent decades building? My name is Amara Choi, and this is the story of how my marriage almost cost my father his life's work. Looking back now, I can finally see all the warning signs I ignored. At the time, they looked like ordinary moments. Small conversations. Harmless favors. Tiny decisions that didn't seem important. But those little moments eventually became the foundation of the biggest betrayal I had ever experienced. I was 32 years old when everything began to fall apart. I worked as the in-house corporate attorney for my father's logistics company, Choi Meridian Logistics, a business my father had built from a single rented warehouse nearly 35 years earlier. Growing up, I never imagined inheriting a successful company. My father made sure of that. He believed every member of the family had to earn their place, including me. When I graduated from law school, I wasn't given a comfortable executive office. Instead, I spent months rotating through different departments. I worked with warehouse supervisors during overnight shifts, learned inventory systems alongside operations staff, handled customer complaints in the service division, and even accompanied delivery teams across multiple states. Those years taught me something simple but important. A company isn't built by boardrooms alone. It's built by people who trust each other every single day. That trust was the reason our company had survived economic downturns, supply chain disruptions, and fierce competition. Employees often stayed with us for decades because they believed they were building something meaningful instead of simply collecting paychecks. Outside of work, my life seemed just as stable. 3 years earlier, I had married Rowan Ashford. We met at an industry conference where he impressed everyone with his confidence and polished communication skills. He knew exactly what to say in every conversation. He was attentive without being overbearing, ambitious without appearing arrogant, and patient enough to earn my father's respect. Dad rarely trusted outsiders. But Rowan was different. Within a year, he was joining family dinners, attending company charity events, and helping organize business networking opportunities. Everyone around us believed he genuinely cared about our family. Then there was his mother, Lysandra Vale. She carried herself with effortless elegance. Every word she spoke sounded measured and thoughtful. She never raised her voice. She never criticized anyone directly. Instead, she mastered the art of making suggestions that somehow became everyone's decisions. From the moment I married Rowan, she treated me with remarkable warmth. She never missed my birthday. She sent handwritten cards during holidays. She complimented my work ethic whenever we attended family gatherings. Whenever people praised our marriage, she would smile and gently say, "You're not my daughter-in-law. You're my daughter." Hearing those words always made me feel accepted. Today, I understand that acceptance can sometimes become the easiest disguise for control. About 6 months after the wedding, my father's company entered an aggressive expansion phase. We opened new regional offices, secured several national transportation contracts, and needed additional employees across multiple departments. Hiring naturally increased. No one questioned it at first. Human Resources announced new team members almost every month. Finance welcomed experienced analysts. Procurement added specialists. Operations recruited supervisors with impressive resumes. Customer relations expanded rapidly. Even our internal security department grew larger than it had ever been. Business was booming. Everything looked perfectly reasonable. Still, something felt slightly off. Whenever I attended orientation meetings for new hires, I noticed an unusual pattern. Many of them seemed oddly familiar with one another despite supposedly coming from different cities, industries, and companies. They didn't openly socialize, but there was a quiet level of comfort between them that experienced recruiters usually notice immediately. At first, I dismissed the feeling. Coincidences happen. Successful companies attract professionals from similar networks. There was no reason to be suspicious. Several weeks later, another new group joined. Then another. And another. The hiring reports became thicker every quarter. As our company grew, I found myself spending more time reviewing contracts than personnel records. My legal responsibilities expanded alongside the business, leaving human resources to manage recruitment independently. Whenever I casually asked where certain candidates had been sourced, the answer sounded perfectly ordinary. Executive recruiters. Professional referrals. Industry recommendations. Everything appeared properly documented. Meanwhile, Rowan became increasingly involved in company discussions despite never officially holding an executive position. Dad appreciated his business opinions, especially regarding organizational efficiency and leadership development. I didn't mind. In fact, I was proud that my husband wanted to contribute. Family businesses often become stronger when relatives genuinely care about helping. Or at least that's what I believed back then. As the months passed, familiar faces slowly became unfamiliar ones. Longtime managers accepted early retirement. Several department supervisors unexpectedly resigned. A handful transferred to newly created positions with less influence. Their replacements happened to be among the recent hires. Again, each promotion looked justified. Every candidate had excellent qualifications. Every recommendation was supported by paperwork. Nothing violated company policy. Nothing appeared illegal. Nothing seemed dramatic enough to trigger concern. One afternoon, while leaving a quarterly leadership meeting, I glanced across the executive parking lot and noticed Lysandra speaking privately with one of our newest operations managers. The conversation lasted less than a minute. They exchanged polite smiles before walking in opposite directions. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't secretive. If anything, it looked completely harmless. When I later mentioned seeing them together, Rowan laughed softly. "My mom knows people everywhere," he said. "She's probably met him at some charity event." Dad was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks later, but his doctors remained firm. They wanted him resting at home, attending physical therapy, and avoiding any major business decisions until they were confident his recovery was complete. That left the executive team responsible for keeping Choi Meridian logistics moving. On paper, everything looked organized. In reality, something inside the company had begun shifting in ways I couldn't immediately explain. Every Monday morning, our executive committee held a leadership meeting in the main conference room. Before Dad's stroke, he chaired every session himself. He expected open discussion, welcomed disagreements, and never allowed anyone to dominate the conversation. Now the meetings felt different. People spoke less. Questions ended faster. Recommendations were approved with surprising speed. I noticed department heads glancing toward Rowan before offering their opinions, even though he wasn't officially part of the executive committee. At first I assumed they simply respected his perspective. After all, he had been attending more meetings during Dad's recovery to help coordinate communication. That was the phrase everyone kept using. Help coordinate. Help organize. Help streamline. Every explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. Yet every week I felt slightly more like an outsider inside my own family's company. One Tuesday afternoon, I requested updated staffing reports from Human Resources. Normally, they would arrive within an hour. Instead, I received an email saying the files were still being finalized. That had never happened before. The following morning, I walked downstairs to HR myself. The department director greeted me politely, but looked unusually nervous. "I'm sorry, Amara," she said. "Some personnel files are being reviewed before release." Reviewed by whom? She hesitated. The Executive Transition Committee. I frowned. "We don't have an Executive Transition Committee." She immediately looked uncomfortable. I thought it had already been announced. No announcement had ever reached me. When I asked for additional details, she apologized again and claimed she wasn't authorized to discuss it further. I left with more questions than answers. Later that afternoon, I searched our internal governance records. There was no mention of any transition committee. No board resolution. No executive vote. Nothing. It was as if someone had invented an authority that technically didn't exist. A few days later, I attended lunch with several longtime department managers. Normally, our conversations drifted between company projects and family life. This time they seemed strangely careful. Whenever I asked about staffing changes, someone immediately changed the subject. Whenever Rowan's name came up, silence followed. People who had worked beside me for years suddenly measured every sentence before speaking. One manager accidentally said something that caught my attention. "We've already adjusted for the new reporting structure." The table went quiet. I looked at him. "What new reporting structure?" His face immediately changed. I misspoke. "No," I replied calmly. "What reporting structure? There isn't one." The conversation ended there. The manager excused himself less than 5 minutes later. I watched him leave, wondering why a simple question had frightened him. By early autumn, another pattern became impossible to ignore. Several experienced employees whom my father deeply trusted had quietly accepted retirement packages months earlier than expected. Others had transferred into advisory positions with almost no decision-making authority. Their replacements happened to be employees hired within the last 18 months. Every promotion followed company policy. Every resume looked impressive. Every performance review praised exceptional leadership potential. Nothing appeared fraudulent. Nothing looked illegal. Yet somehow the company's culture had changed almost overnight. People who once challenged ideas openly now waited for approval before speaking. One evening I stayed late reviewing procurement contracts. The office had mostly emptied when I realized I'd left my notebook upstairs. As I walked toward the executive floor, voices echoed from the conference room. The lights were still on. The door wasn't fully closed. I recognized one voice immediately. "Lysandra." I stopped. She wasn't speaking loudly. She sounded calm, confident. Consistency matters more than speed. Another voice answered. "We've completed most of the placements." "Placements?" Lysandra continued. "Good. Maintain discipline. We don't need unnecessary attention." I couldn't hear the rest. Footsteps approached the doorway. I stepped back before anyone saw me. A moment later, 3 department managers exited the room. Behind them walked Lysandra. She smiled warmly when she noticed me. "Amara," she said pleasantly. "Working late again?" I forced a smile. "I could ask you the same thing." She laughed softly. "Oh, Rowan invited me to share a few leadership ideas." Nothing formal. Everything about her tone sounded effortless, natural, almost comforting. Still, why was my mother-in-law discussing leadership strategy inside our executive conference room after business hours? When I mentioned the meeting to Rowan during dinner, he barely looked up from his plate. Mom mentors executives all the time. Inside our company? It's temporary. Who approved it? He shrugged. Dad appreciated her experience. I paused. My father never mentioned that. He's been dealing with his health, Amara. The conversation ended there. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Something kept bothering me. Not because I believed Rowan was lying. Because every answer I received somehow explained everything, while revealing absolutely nothing. The following week, I requested electronic approval logs for several recent executive decisions. As corporate counsel, I had full authorization to review them. When the files arrived, one detail immediately caught my attention. Every major restructuring decision carried my father's digital authorization. The dates made no sense. On one approval, Dad had supposedly signed documents while attending physical therapy 2 hours away. Another approval appeared during a weekend when he had been recovering at home without access to his office computer. I checked another. Then another. Then another. The electronic signatures looked authentic. The timestamps looked authentic. Everything appeared genuine. Except I knew exactly where my father had been on those days. Because I had driven him there myself. For several minutes I simply stared at the screen. Either the records were wrong, or someone had found a way to make impossible approvals appear completely legitimate. I printed every document before the files could be altered. Then I locked them inside my office cabinet. The next morning I decided to confront Rowan. I expected confusion, maybe even concern. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and smiled as though I had asked about the weather. "You're overthinking this," he said. "I know where my father was." "So do I." "Then explain the signatures." "There are perfectly reasonable explanations." "Like what?" He held my gaze for several seconds. "You should spend less time looking for problems." His answer settled something inside me. For the first time since our marriage, I realized he wasn't trying to reassure me. He was trying to stop me from asking questions. 3 days later, as I arrived at my office early in the morning, the receptionist handed me a plain padded envelope. "There wasn't any return address," she said. Inside was a small black flash drive. Nothing else. No letter. No name. Only 3 words written neatly on a folded piece of paper. "Trust nobody inside." I stared at the note for several seconds. Then I looked through the glass walls of the lobby. Employees walked past exactly as they always had. They smiled. They greeted one another. Everything appeared completely normal. But for the first time, I wondered how many of those familiar faces were hiding something I still couldn't see. I carried the flash drive in my purse for nearly 2 days before I finally gathered the courage to open it. Part of me believed it was probably nothing. A prank. An anonymous complaint. Maybe even malware designed to scare me. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about those 3 handwritten words. Trust nobody inside. On Friday evening, after most employees had gone home, I locked my office door, disconnected my work laptop from the company's network, and used an old personal computer I kept for offline legal research. If the drive contained anything dangerous, I wasn't going to risk exposing company systems. I inserted the flash drive. Only one folder appeared. No title. No description. Inside were dozens of audio files. Each file was labeled only with a date. The earliest recording was almost 2 years old. The newest had been created less than 3 weeks earlier. I clicked the oldest file. At first, all I heard was the sound of chairs moving across a conference room floor. Someone poured coffee. Papers shuffled. Then voices. I immediately recognized several senior managers. A few seconds later, another voice joined the conversation. Lysandra. She wasn't visiting. She wasn't making polite conversation. She was directing the discussion. Replace him after the quarterly review. Someone answered. He's loyal to Mr. Choi. Exactly, Lysandra replied calmly. We need people who are loyal to the future. The room fell silent before another executive quietly agreed. I stopped the recording. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear my own breathing. I played another file. Different date. Different meeting. Same voice. This time she discussed promotions. Not recommendations. Not opinions. Instructions. Move him into procurement. Delay her transfer. Approve this candidate. Every sentence sounded like an order. No one questioned her. No one argued. They simply accepted whatever she decided. I opened another recording. Then another. Hours disappeared without me noticing. One thing became painfully clear. Lysandra had been participating in private leadership meetings for far longer than I realized. She wasn't simply influencing Rowan. She was quietly influencing the people around him. Then I started writing down names. Every employee mentioned in the recordings appeared on recent organizational charts. One after another. 27 names. The same 27 people hired over the past 18 months. Until that moment, I had assumed someone was stealing money, or manipulating contracts, or preparing for some kind of illegal takeover. I was wrong. The recordings revealed something far more patient, far more dangerous. Lysandra wasn't trying to own the company. She was trying to make sure every important decision passed through people who answered to her before they answered to anyone else. Ownership didn't matter. Control did. If enough department heads quietly followed her instructions, she wouldn't need company shares. She wouldn't need an executive title. The organization itself would eventually move in whatever direction she wanted. It was a strategy designed to leave almost no obvious evidence. Every promotion looked deserved. Every hiring decision appeared professional. Every restructuring seemed logical. Viewed individually, nothing raised alarms. Viewed together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I spent the entire weekend reviewing every recording. The more I listened, the more I noticed something unusual. Lysandra rarely spoke about profits. She rarely discussed financial performance. Instead, she focused on influence. Who supervised whom? Who attended meetings? Who received confidential reports? Who controlled communication between departments? It wasn't about money. It was about building invisible authority. Monday morning arrived far too quickly. I barely slept. I considered going directly to the board. Then I imagined explaining anonymous recordings without knowing who had created them. No investigator would accept unidentified evidence without verifying its source. I needed to know where the recordings had come from. That answer arrived sooner than I expected. Just before lunch, my assistant informed me that someone wanted to meet privately. He says it's important, she whispered. Does he have an appointment? No. What's his name? Elias Mercer. I immediately recognized it. Elias had worked for my father longer than almost anyone else. He managed building maintenance for 26 years before retiring 6 months earlier. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't involved in company politics. He was simply one of those dependable employees everyone trusted. I invited him inside. He looked older than I remembered, but his posture remained straight and confident. Instead of shaking my hand, he quietly placed an old leather notebook on my desk. I wondered how long it would take before someone asked the right questions, he said. I stared at him. Did you send the flash drive? He nodded once. I did. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Finally I asked the question that mattered most. Where did those recordings come from? He opened the notebook. Inside were handwritten diagrams of conference rooms dating back nearly 10 years. When your father renovated the executive floor, Elias explained, I supervised every installation. He pointed toward several pages. The board requested upgraded presentation equipment. I nodded. I remember. There was unused storage space behind the wall panels. I frowned. I don't understand. He looked directly into my eyes. I installed backup audio systems. I blinked. You secretly recorded executive meetings? No. His answer surprised me. The recording system existed to protect the company. He leaned forward slightly. Years ago, someone accused your father of approving a contract he had actually rejected. There was no proof of what happened during that meeting. I remembered the incident. It had nearly become a lawsuit. After that, Elias continued, your father asked me whether meeting records could be preserved for legal disputes. So he knew. No. He knew discussions could be archived. He never knew I continued preserving backup copies after the official system was discontinued. I looked at the flash drive. You kept recording anyway? I kept protecting the company. His voice remained calm. Then I started hearing meetings that made no sense. He described watching unfamiliar executives enter conference rooms after business hours. Watching department heads who had never socialized suddenly meeting in private. Watching Lysandra become a regular presence despite holding no position inside the company. I couldn't accuse anyone without evidence, he said. So I waited. For 2 years. I waited for someone inside the family to notice something was wrong. I lowered my eyes toward the notebook. You trusted me. I trusted your father. He smiled faintly. And I knew he'd raise a daughter who wouldn't ignore the truth forever. His words stayed with me long after he finished speaking. Before leaving, Elias handed me a second envelope. Inside were printed organizational charts. Every employee connected to the recordings had been highlighted. 27 names. 27 positions. 27 quiet changes. None of them looked suspicious alone. Together they formed something that made my stomach tighten. A map. Not of departments. Of influence. As Elias reached the door, he stopped without turning around. "You've only discovered how they got inside," he said. "You still don't know why." Then he walked away. I sat alone in my office, staring at the charts spread across my desk. For days I had believed I was uncovering the entire conspiracy. Now I realized I had only uncovered its first layer. And whatever came next was going to be much worse. I locked my office door and spread Elias's organizational charts across the conference table inside my office. Each page represented a different department. Finance, operations, procurement, compliance, human resources, regional management, customer relations, warehouse administration. Individually, nothing looked alarming. Collectively, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every highlighted employee occupied a position where information flowed before decisions were made. Not necessarily the highest-ranking jobs. Not always executive positions. But roles that quietly influenced everything. People who reviewed reports before directors saw them. Managers who scheduled meetings. Analysts who prepared financial summaries. Supervisors who recommended promotions. They weren't controlling the company from the top. They were controlling what reached the top. That realization chilled me more than any accusation ever could. I spent the next several days comparing the recordings with company records. Every promotion. Every transfer. Every retirement. Every resignation. The timing matched almost perfectly. Nothing had happened by accident. Someone had spent years moving people into place with extraordinary patience. On Wednesday afternoon, I requested access to archived recruiting contracts. As corporate counsel, I had legal authority to review vendor agreements. Most files appeared ordinary. Then I noticed something unusual. Over the past 2 years, nearly every executive-level recruitment assignment had been handled by the same consulting firm. Sterling Horizon Advisory. The name sounded vaguely familiar. I searched the company database. Professional references. Positive evaluations. Successful placements. Excellent industry reputation. Nothing suspicious. Still, I wrote the name down. Later that evening I drove home earlier than usual. Rowan was already there. He seemed unusually relaxed, sitting on the patio with a glass of wine as though nothing in the world had changed. "You've been working too hard," he said with a smile. "I've been looking into recent staffing decisions." His expression barely changed. "And I think someone has been influencing executive appointments." He remained silent for several seconds before taking another sip. "Companies evolve, Amara. That's not an answer." "No, it isn't." His calmness unsettled me. Most innocent people become confused when accused of something they don't understand. Rowan looked prepared, almost relieved that the conversation had finally happened. I sat across from him. "I know your mother has been attending private meetings." He smiled faintly. "My mother enjoys advising people." I heard recordings. That finally caught his attention. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "What recordings?" "I think you already know." Silence settled between us. The evening breeze moved through the trees, while neither of us spoke. Finally Rowan leaned forward. "You've always believed your father built an unstoppable company." "He did." "No. He built a company that depended on one generation." I stared at him. "What does that even mean?" "It means businesses don't survive by staying the same." I folded my arms. "So your solution was secretly replacing the people who built it?" I never said replacing. You don't have to. His voice remained remarkably calm. You think this is about stealing ownership, isn't it? He slowly shook his head. You still don't understand my mother. I felt my patience disappear. Then explain it. He looked directly at me. My mother doesn't care about your father's shares. That wasn't the answer I expected. She cares about influence. Those were the exact words I had written in my notebook after listening to the recordings. Rowan continued speaking before I could interrupt. Your father built an excellent company, but he trusted loyalty too much. He promoted people because they'd been around for years. They became comfortable. My mother believes organizations should always be guided by people who can adapt. You mean people loyal to her? He didn't deny it. Instead, he quietly nodded. People loyal to a long-term vision. I almost laughed. A vision where she controls every important conversation? He looked away. You make it sound sinister. Because it is. He stood and walked toward the patio railing. You know what's funny? What? You think your marriage and the company are separate. I felt my stomach tighten. They never were. He turned around. When I married you, my mother believed our families would naturally become one. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You married me because of the business? I married you because I loved you. He paused. And because our families had compatible futures. Those last 6 words echoed in my mind. Compatible futures. Not love. Not partnership. Strategy. Planning. Expectation. Everything suddenly felt different. Family dinners. Holiday gatherings. Business conferences. Every conversation with Lysandra. Every compliment. Every thoughtful gift. Every smile. Had any of it been genuine? I stood slowly. So, this was always the plan? No. The plan evolved. When? When your father refused to step back. His answer hit harder than I expected. Dad had never planned to retire early. He enjoyed working. He enjoyed mentoring younger leaders. Apparently, that decision had become an obstacle. You expected him to hand everything over. We expected a smoother transition. There was never supposed to be a transition. Rowan sighed. That's exactly the problem. I looked at the man I had spent 3 years calling my husband. For the first time, I realized we weren't having an argument. We were finally speaking honestly. I can't stay married to someone who thinks my family is a business project. His face remained expressionless. I figured you'd say that. The absence of emotion hurt almost as much as the confession itself. There was no desperation. No apology. No attempt to fix anything. Only acceptance. As though this outcome had always been possible. The next morning I contacted my attorney. By noon, divorce papers were being prepared. I didn't tell anyone outside my legal team. Not even my father. I wanted to protect his recovery from additional stress. 3 days later, Rowan was formally served. The reaction inside the company was immediate. People who had avoided me for months suddenly began asking whether we could speak privately. One manager requested a confidential meeting before work. Another sent encrypted documents from a personal email account. A regional director asked if we could meet outside the office instead of inside company headquarters. The fear that had silenced so many employees seemed to disappear almost overnight. Without my marriage connecting me to Rowan, people no longer worried about choosing the wrong side. By the end of that week, my office calendar was completely full. Employees wanted to talk. Former managers wanted to talk. Even people who had already resigned wanted to talk. The divorce hadn't just ended my marriage. It had broken the wall of silence surrounding the company. And every conversation pointed toward one name I hadn't yet fully investigated. Sterling Horizon Advisory. I still didn't know exactly what that consulting firm was. But I had a feeling the answer hidden inside it would explain everything. The Monday after Rowan was served with divorce papers felt completely different from every other Monday I had experienced inside the company. For months, people had avoided eye contact. Now they were knocking on my office door before 8 in the morning. The first person to arrive was Denise Holloway, a procurement manager who had worked for my father for nearly 15 years. She closed the door behind her before saying a single word. "I've been waiting for this." I invited her to sit. She placed a thick folder on my desk. "I don't know everything," she admitted, "but I know enough to tell you something isn't right." Inside the folder were copies of vendor recommendation reports. At first glance they looked routine. Then I noticed something unusual. Different departments had recommended entirely different suppliers. Yet the final approvals consistently favored companies connected to one consulting network. Sterling Horizon Advisory. Again, the same name. Denise explained that department managers often submitted multiple qualified options. By the time recommendations reached executive review, only one option remained. Nobody could explain who removed the others. Nobody questioned it because the chosen vendors still met company standards. Everything stayed technically compliant. Everything stayed legally defensible. But the outcome was always the same. After Denise left, another employee arrived. Then another. Then another. By the end of the week, I had spoken with 11 current employees and 6 former managers. Their stories sounded different. Their experiences varied. Yet one detail remained consistent. Whenever an important leadership position became available, Sterling Horizon Advisory somehow appeared in the conversation. Sometimes they recommended candidates. Sometimes they evaluated organizational structure. Sometimes they advised succession planning. Officially, they were merely consultants. Unofficially, they seemed to influence almost every executive decision. I finally decided it was time to investigate the consulting firm itself. As corporate counsel, I requested every contract our company had ever signed with Sterling Horizon. The agreements stretched back nearly 5 years. Most described ordinary executive search services, leadership assessments, recruitment support, management consulting. Nothing unusual. Until I reached the ownership disclosures. I read the document twice. Then a third time. The listed parent company had changed ownership 3 years earlier. The acquiring investor wasn't identified by name. Instead, it appeared through a private holding corporation. Fortunately, corporate ownership records required additional filings. After tracing several registration documents, I eventually found the controlling shareholder. Vail Strategic Holdings. I felt my pulse quicken. Vail. Lysandra's family name. Sterling Horizon wasn't simply recommending employees. Her family owned the consulting company. I immediately contacted outside forensic attorneys. Within days they began reviewing every placement Sterling Horizon had made inside Choi Meridian Logistics. The results stunned all of us. The 27 employees hadn't applied independently. They had all entered the company through recruitment projects managed by Sterling Horizon. Every background check was legitimate. Every qualification was genuine. None of them were fake employees. That wasn't the scheme. The recruitment process itself had become the strategy. Lysandra didn't need unqualified people. She needed capable professionals who already trusted her family's leadership philosophy. People who would naturally support decisions aligned with her influence. It was brilliant. Disturbingly brilliant. No laws prohibited consulting firms from recommending candidates they preferred. No regulation required recruits to disclose personal loyalty unless financial conflicts existed. Everything operated within carefully designed legal boundaries. Until one overlooked detail changed everything. During forensic review, our outside investigators compared internal communications with mandatory conflict of interest disclosures. Several executives had failed to report ongoing financial relationships with Vail Strategic Holdings. Some received consulting retainers. Others served on advisory boards connected to Lysandra's investment network. None of those relationships had been disclosed to our company. That changed the case completely. This was no longer about influence alone. It had become a matter of undisclosed conflicts of interest affecting executive decision-making. Once our board received the report, they voted unanimously to begin an independent investigation. Outside auditors entered company headquarters the following morning. Word spread quickly. Employees whispered in hallways. Managers canceled meetings. Department heads suddenly became unavailable. Within 48 hours, resignation letters started appearing. Some claimed personal reasons. Others announced retirement. A few simply stopped coming to work. The carefully constructed network had begun collapsing under its own weight. News of the investigation soon reached other corporations that had also hired Sterling Horizon Advisory. One company contacted our legal team. Then another. Soon investigators discovered a pattern extending far beyond my father's business. Sterling Horizon had quietly placed executives inside multiple companies across several industries. Not every placement involved wrongdoing, but enough undisclosed relationships existed to trigger broader regulatory inquiries. Lysandra's influence had expanded much further than any of us imagined. Television reporters eventually contacted our communications department. Industry publications began publishing articles questioning executive recruiting practices. Corporate governance experts debated whether consulting firms should face stricter disclosure requirements. The story had grown larger than our family. Far larger. Meanwhile, Rowan attempted to defend his mother publicly. He released a carefully written statement claiming the investigation misunderstood legitimate business consulting. For nearly 24 hours, some people believed him. Then investigators uncovered archived email exchanges. Those emails revealed that Rowan had personally instructed several executives not to disclose relationships connected to Vail Strategic Holdings because, in his own words, additional paperwork would only create unnecessary confusion. That single sentence destroyed his credibility. The email spread quickly through legal circles and business media. Professional organizations suspended his memberships. Several boards removed him from advisory positions. Speaking invitations disappeared. The career he had spent years building collapsed in a matter of weeks. As for Lysandra, she refused every interview request. Her attorneys released brief statements denying intentional misconduct. But evidence continued accumulating. Regulatory agencies suspended Sterling Horizon Advisory's executive placement licenses while investigations continued. Corporate clients terminated contracts almost immediately. Civil lawsuits followed. The consulting empire she had spent years building began falling apart piece by piece. Late one evening, after another exhausting meeting with investigators, I stood alone inside my father's office. The room looked exactly as it always had. Family photographs. Old industry awards. Shelves filled with decades of business journals. Nothing inside had changed. Yet everything outside those walls had. I looked at Dad's empty chair and realized something unexpected. For months I believed I had been fighting to save a company. Now I understood I had actually been fighting to protect the values that built it. The company could recover from financial loss. It could recover from leadership changes. But if trust disappeared completely, there would be nothing worth saving. I thought the investigation had finally uncovered every secret. I was wrong. One final conversation with my father would change the way I viewed everything that had happened, including my own future. Nearly a year had passed since I filed for divorce. Sometimes I still found myself expecting to hear Rowan's voice when I walked into the house we had once shared. Then I would remember that chapter of my life had finally ended. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. Dad completed his rehabilitation earlier than his doctors had predicted. Watching him walk back into company headquarters for the first time brought tears to the eyes of employees who had known him for decades. People lined the lobby to welcome him home. Some applauded. Others simply smiled. Dad thanked everyone personally before asking for only one thing. Let's earn each other's trust again. No speech. No celebration. Just one sentence. It perfectly reflected the kind of leader he had always been. Over the following months, rebuilding the company became our highest priority. We hired an independent governance committee with no previous ties to the business. Executive recruitment procedures were completely redesigned. Every outside consulting firm had to disclose ownership structures, financial relationships, and potential conflicts of interest before being considered. Promotion decisions no longer depended on recommendations from a single executive. Instead, multiple departments participated in every major appointment. Internal audits became permanent rather than occasional. Anonymous reporting channels were strengthened. No employee would ever again have to wonder whether speaking up might cost them their career. The atmosphere inside the company slowly transformed. Meetings became livelier. People challenged ideas without fear. Managers debated openly. New employees asked difficult questions. For the first time in years, disagreement no longer felt dangerous. It felt healthy. The legal investigations continued outside our company. Sterling Horizon Advisory officially lost its executive placement licenses after regulators concluded the firm had repeatedly failed to disclose material conflicts of interest. Its largest corporate clients terminated their contracts. Several investors withdrew funding. Within months, the consulting firm announced it would cease operations. Vail Strategic Holdings also suffered enormous financial damage. Business partners distanced themselves almost immediately. Banks tightened lending requirements. Investment opportunities disappeared one after another. Influence, I learned, can vanish much faster than it is built. Lysandra remained determined to protect her public image. She avoided interviews and declined every opportunity to explain her actions. But reputation does not disappear because people accuse you. It disappears when people stop trusting you. Industry leaders who once welcomed her into private boardrooms quietly closed their doors. Conference invitations stopped arriving. Professional organizations removed her from advisory panels. She had spent years building a network based on influence. Now that same network dissolved without anyone needing to force it. Rowan's situation became even more painful to watch. His legal troubles eventually ended with financial settlements rather than criminal charges. He wasn't convicted of a crime. But professionally, the damage was irreversible. Recruiters stopped returning his calls. Former colleagues kept their distance. Companies that once competed for his expertise suddenly found other candidates. One afternoon, several months after everything settled, he asked if we could meet. Curiosity outweighed hesitation. We met at a quiet coffee shop halfway across the city. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. Life had finally caught up with him. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at his untouched coffee. I thought we were building something bigger than ourselves. His voice sounded tired. I answered honestly. I thought we were building a family. He closed his eyes for a moment. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I just wanted you to know. I didn't realize how much of my own life I had surrendered. I believed him. Not because it erased what happened, but because I could finally see the difference between explanation and excuse. He had made his choices. Now he had to live with them. When we stood to leave, he quietly wished me well. I did the same. There was no anger left, only distance. Some stories don't end with revenge. Some end with acceptance. Dad officially stepped back from daily operations 6 months later. This time it happened on his own terms. Not because anyone pressured him. Not because someone manipulated the organization. Because he was finally ready. Before leaving the office that evening, he handed me the company access card he had carried for decades. I trusted you long before any of this happened, he said. I just needed you to trust yourself. Those words meant more to me than any promotion ever could. Today, Choi Meridian Logistics is stronger than it was before the crisis. Not because we became larger, Not because we became richer. Because we became more transparent. We learned that strong businesses are not protected by impressive buildings, expensive technology, or famous executives. They're protected by honesty, accountability, and people willing to ask difficult questions even when the answers might hurt. As for me, the divorce I once feared became the beginning of my freedom. Losing a marriage hurt. Discovering betrayal hurt even more. But staying would have cost me my integrity, my family, and everything my father had spent his life creating. Walking away wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I finally started living it on my own terms. If there's one lesson I hope you take from everything I've shared, it's this. Never confuse kindness with trust, and never assume that silence means everything is fine. Sometimes the biggest threats don't arrive with loud warnings. They arrive politely, patiently, and wearing familiar smiles. The courage to ask uncomfortable questions can save far more than a business. It can save your future. Thank you so much for spending your time with me and staying until the very end of my story. If you enjoyed this journey, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future stories filled with family drama, unexpected betrayals, and hard-earned justice. Until next time, take care of yourself, and thank you for listening.